Hey, what is up everybody? Zach here. Welcome back to Case Digital. In today's video, we are answering the question of how to write to a file in Python. So, without further ado, let's hop right in and start coding. What up everybody? Like I mentioned in this video, I'm going to show you how to write to a file in Python. And in particular, I'm going to show you two different methods that you can use to write to a file. But first, let's kind of explain the setup. Essentially, what we're going to have is this text that's going to say, hey, subscribe to Case Digital. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button and the like button below. But let's hop right in and start talking about method number one. All right, so method number one is essentially using the open function. And this is essentially how you open files, and you pass in, the name of the file and certain parameters, and what you pass in will determine what you're actually going to do with that file. So for example, we're calling open, and we're calling a file called method1.txt. Now you can notice in my folder, and I'm showing this today, in my folder where I'm running everything, there is no file called method1.txt or .txt. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to write. If you put a write in there, or a W, it's going to do a write. If you put an R, it's going to do a read. So if there's no file in there and you do a write, it's going to actually it's going to create that file and then start overwriting it. And even if there was a file there and you were to create something and you did a W there, it would overwrite that file. So that's something you need to be careful when you do these file calls, is what you're passing in. And you can see, let's see if this shows in here the examples of what you can use. But essentially you can, I think even if you put an A in there, it'll do append. So it'll be like, it'll write to it and then it'll just like append to the file, and not exactly overwrite it. But we can test it out. But essentially I'm passing in that text, subscribe to Case Digital, and I'm passing it into this file handler. Now this file handler has a bunch of different functions in it, and one of them which is write. So now if I do .write.txt, I can just write and it'll create my file and write my text, subscribe to Case Digital, to that file. Now the one thing that if you do this with this method with open, you need to make sure you close your file handler, because you can get into some weird issues, and we just want to make sure when we open something, we close something. That's just something that you always want to do in a program, regardless of what you're doing in what language you're doing. But I'll show you a way in method 2. So stick to the end, because in method 2, I'm going to show you a way where you don't have to necessarily call close. This next method will show you it'll kind of close on its own with the way that you do it. And so you can kind of get 2 lines rather than 3 lines of code, and it's kind of safer in the long run. But essentially, if I run this program right here, so Python examples, and I run it, nothing happened because I forgot to uncomment this. So now I'm going to do method 1. I'm going to pass in that text, subscribe to Case Digital. And if I do that, you'll see, hey, look, method number 1 just got created over here. And inside that, method number 1.txt file just got created, and inside it says subscribe to Case Digital. Now, let's kind of change this a minute. Let's just say, we'll just say subscribe, and we'll just add we'll just do please. Now, we'll rerun this and see, like, again, with the W, what it should do, or correct me if I'm wrong, is essentially this method number 1, it just overwrites it. So that means that if I had this, like, say I was writing like a novel, or I opened a file or something, and I tried to write to it, if you just use W, it will just overwrite everything. So let's try and put in an A in here, and I think it's A. It's either that or it's W plus. And we'll change this. We'll take this off now, and we'll see what it does. So if I come down here, now look, hey, look, it actually appended to it. And that's the one thing that you need to be careful of when you're doing stuff like whether it's just straight up overwriting or appending, is the way that you do it. Like this was the end of this is the way the file was before, and then this is the string that we added. So depending on how you do it, you just need to make sure you have your new lines in the correct spots or whatnot, because now if I come in here and I add a new line, and I added, like, say we'll do 2 new lines, and I write this to a file, and I just did append, so now I appended. So remember, I did 2 new lines, so 1, 2, the start of the file, or the string, and then another new line. That's why we have 4. That's why it shows 4 lines. So that's one method of how you can write to a file. Again, that's we're using both the append method and just the straight up, if you want to overwrite and just create it and write it. And I actually think, let's just test one thing really quick here. I think if you do, we'll delete this, move that to the trash. And then I think if you do an append and it's not there, let's double check this. Oh yeah, even if you do an append and the file is not there, it will create it for you and actually write out to the file. So now if we check, there it is. So that's exactly how you write to a file using method number 1. You need a file, you need to use the open function, and then you need to make sure you close it. Now, let's talk about method number 2, where you don't necessarily need to explicitly call the close, because the way that we will write it will close it for us. So let's talk about method number 2. Okay, so method number 2 is actually going to be a little bit different. I mean, it's going to still use this open function, but instead we're going to use this with, the keyword of with. If I do with open, essentially with open, put in basically the same stuff, right? The name of my file, how I'm going to actually, what I actually want to do with that file, like in this case, write to it, and then and then pass it like a parameter that we can use. Now what happens is when I do with open as this file handler, now I have this file handler that I can use down here. And then anytime, once I come out to this new line, essentially, I believe it'll basically close that file handler and make it so that you're basically using just a file handler within this block of text right here. And because that's what with essentially basically makes it so that you kind of do everything inside that little block of text and have access to kind of that file, and then it'll basically close it for you. So now if I run this, if I comment or I uncommented that, so if I run it again, you'll see now I've created a method 2 .txt, and again the same text. I did method number 1 and then method number 2. You can see that they're this. Well, I appended to method number 1 up here because I left it as an A. If I did this as a W and I reran this, essentially they would be the exact same. So those are the 2 different methods that you can use. Now, what I personally use is this with handler, because you'll see a lot of things in Python where people will use the with operator. Now, there's a time and a place to use the open. Like maybe you need to create the file handler and pass it along, and you don't necessarily want to use with. But if you're basically doing your file creation and manipulation kind of all in one spot, then I would go with, and that's just because you don't have to necessarily worry about this close. As soon as you exit and come out here and do your stuff, it's basically closed for you. Or Python in the background will take care of it as long as you're not reusing it. But this is kind of the one that I use, just because that's the one that I, kind of found online, that so they kind of like say, hey, like this is the way that people do it. This is the way that people in Python do it. But granted, there is a time and a place where you use open and then have to close it. And a lot of times that's when you create a method or you create your file handler, and then you pass that along into some function or do something with it or somewhere else in your code, and you write and then you close out at the end or something. But those are the 2 different methods. Again, using open and close, and then with open, which I feel like you'll find is probably the most what they say Pythonic way of doing stuff. But if you do with open, again, the name of the file, this can also be a variable, just needs to be the name of the file with the extension, and then what you want to do. So write, append, read if you want to read from a file, but again, we're talking about writing to a file, and then you just say filehandler.write and then pass in the text and it'll do it for you. So hope that helps. And if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments below. Let me know which method you like best, or which one you found in your programming that you've used the most. And if you haven't already, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribing, and until next time, keep on coding.